Welcome to Informatica Support Multimedia Sessions. I am Ajay from Global Customer Support Team, and in this session I am going to explain how to configure Informatica Data Service JDBC driver for accessing SQL data service objects from IBM Websphere Application Server. Like many other JDBC client tools, IBM Websphere has provision to configure the JDBC driver to access the Informatica data service objects. So the agenda for today is to know the prerequisites and steps involved in configuring Informatica JDBC driver and creating data source in IBM Websphere console, followed by a demo of configuration steps, and at the end the information on necessary EBFs. Among the prerequisites, first one is to have an Informatica server with a SQL data service object deployed on a DIS service, and it should be in available state. Next, the IBM Websphere Application Server need to be running and should have access to the Websphere console. And lastly, Informatica data service driver jar file should be copied onto the Websphere server into a directory accessible to the Websphere user. Once these prerequisites are met, user can move to configuration part. For the first time, creation of JDBC data source in Websphere involves two-step process, where the first one is to configure the JDBC provider and then the creation of data source. Detailed steps with screenshots on creating JDBC provider is shown in the next 3 slides. Briefly, it is about choosing database type, name for the provider, driver class, driver jar path. Once the provider is created, data source can be created as shown in the next 3 slides. Briefly, specifying the source name, JNDI name, JDBC provider, helper class. Once the data source is created, SQL data service details are to be updated in the data source properties before testing the connection. Let's quickly move to demo to create a JDBC provider and data source. Before creating the provider, let's verify the prerequisites. Verify SQL data service object deployed on Informatica server. Under DIS applications, we can see SQL data service is in running state. Next, verify the access to Websphere console. Lastly, verify the info.ds jdbc.jar is placed in the directory accessible to Websphere. I have placed the driver jar in C drive IDS demo folder. As the prerequisites are met, let's move to configuration part. To create JDBC provider, under resources, click on JDBC providers. Select new. Select database type as user defined. The implementation class name as com Informatica DS SQL JDBC DRV info connection pool data source. Let's give a name to the provider. Next, the class path. validate the inputs, and then finish. Now the JDBC provider is created. Let's move to creating data source. Click on data sources, new, select a data source name and specify a JNDI name. Choose existing JDBC provider and choose a provider created just now, and leave the helper class name to default value and security aliases to default, and validate the inputs. Finish. Data source created. But the data source creation would be complete only after associating the SQL data service details in the data source created. Open the data source, go to custom properties, specify values for these properties. The DAS name would be the value seen here. Specify host name. Specify username. Make sure the values are applied before moving to update the next property. Port would be HTTP port of the Informatica server. Lastly, SQL data service name. Once all the properties are filled, save. And go back to data source. And can perform test connection now. The test connection is successful, and the warning that we see here is about the data store helper class, which is being used from Websphere, that can be ignored. Now the data source is successfully created and tested. In order to use Informatica Data Service JDBC driver with IBM Websphere, the driver shipped with EBF 14129 has to be used. Otherwise, the data source properties cannot be configured in the Websphere console. It is also worth to verify the applicability of EBF 14484 and 14608 if you run into any other problems while dealing with these data sources. That's it. In case of any feedback, we would love to hear from you, and you can write to us at supportvideos@informatica.com or tweet us at twitter.com/infasupport. Thank you.